There's a specific kind of person who can go through something genuinely hard, a job loss, a diagnosis, a relationship ending, and still not tell a single person until it's already resolved. From the outside, it looks like strength. From the inside, it doesn't feel like much of anything. It just feels normal. If that feels familiar, it may not be a personality trait you were born with. It may be something you were quietly trained into, long before you were old enough to notice it happening. This video is about a generation that grew up in a very specific emotional environment. Not abusive, not neglectful in the dramatic sense, just absent in a particular way. And the adults that environment produced carry something most people don't talk about often enough. A lot of people who grew up in the 70s and 80s were raised during a period when independence wasn't a value that was encouraged, it was simply assumed. Parents worked, doors were unlocked, afternoons were unstructured. You came home, you figured things out, you didn't interrupt adults unless it was urgent, and even then, urgent was a high bar. This wasn't cruelty. For many families, it was survival. Dual incomes were becoming necessary, the culture was shifting, and the idea that children needed consistent emotional check-ins wasn't really part of the conversation yet. But children don't experience context, they experience what's in front of them. And what was in front of many of these kids was a quiet, consistent message. Problems are yours to manage. Feelings are yours to sort. Don't make it someone else's load to carry. So they didn't. And here's what's psychologically interesting about that. When a child learns early that emotional needs go unmet, not through punishment, but through simple absence, they don't necessarily become damaged in visible ways. They adapt. They develop what psychologists sometimes call a highly self-sufficient coping style. They become competent, resourceful, low maintenance, all things that the world tends to reward. The problem isn't the competence, the problem is what gets buried underneath it. Because that same child, now a 45 or 50-year-old adult, often has no real framework for receiving support. Not asking for it, receiving it. Even when it's offered directly, there can be a subtle internal resistance, a sense that depending on someone creates exposure, that needing something from another person is a kind of debt you'll eventually have to repay, or a weakness that might be used against you. It doesn't feel like fear, it just feels like preference. Quick question, and think about this honestly. When someone offers to help you with something difficult, what is your first instinct? A. Genuine relief. B. Gratitude but mild discomfort. C. The urge to minimize what you're going through. Or D. Immediate calculation of what you'll owe them. Most people who grew up in that emotional environment land somewhere between B and C, not because they don't want connection, but because somewhere in their nervous system, need became associated with burden. But here's the part most people miss. This pattern doesn't only show up in crisis moments. It shows up in the smallest, most ordinary interactions. It's the person who won't ask a colleague to clarify something twice because they don't want to seem like they need too much. It's the one who quietly absorbs an unfair workload rather than name it. It's the parent who manages their own grief alone so their kids don't see them struggle, which is almost poetic when you think about it, because it's the same protection they were given, passed forward with the same good intentions and the same quiet cost. The behavior shifts slightly depending on where you are in life. In your 20s, it can look like fierce independence, attractive even. In your 30s, it can start to feel isolating, though most people can't name why. Relationships feel close, but never quite close enough. Intimacy has a ceiling that you didn't consciously install, but can feel yourself running into. By midlife, something else often happens. The coping style that worked for decades starts to feel heavier. Not broken, just heavier, because the things you've been quietly managing have accumulated, and the absence of a support structure, which once felt like freedom, starts to feel more like a room with no door. What makes this harder is that it usually doesn't look dramatic from the outside. These are often highly functional people, good at their jobs, reliable to others, present for everyone around them. The quiet cost is almost always invisible, and it's invisible because they've spent their whole lives making sure it stays that way. Psychologically, what's happening here is a form of emotional self-regulation that was learned in childhood and never updated. The nervous system learned that managing alone was safer than managing with others, not because others were dangerous, but because others were simply not reliably there. So the brain, which is always optimizing for predictability, made a rule. Handle it yourself. It's faster, it's cleaner, it doesn't depend on variables you can't control. That rule was protective once. For a child navigating an adult world with limited guidance, it was probably essential. The difficulty is that the rule doesn't automatically expire when the environment changes. It runs quietly in the background, shaping decisions, filtering relationships, setting the ceiling on how much support a person allows themselves to accept. What tends to shift this, slowly and not through effort alone, is the accumulation of experiences where asking for something didn't lead to burden or loss, where being seen in a moment of need was met with presence rather than absence. That's not a simple fix, it's more like a slow revision of a very old story. But the story is worth knowing, because understanding why you handle things alone is different from believing that's simply who you are. You were not born not needing people. You learned not to rely on them, and there is a meaningful difference between those two things. So here's what I'm curious about. When you go through something difficult, do you genuinely prefer to handle it alone, or has silence just become the most familiar option? Let me know in the comments. I'd actually be curious to hear where you land on that.